When Mara Ellington stumbled into that isolated frontier cabin on the coldest night of winter, desperate and alone, she asked the quiet stranger where she should sleep. He pulled back a blanket beside the crackling fire, his weathered face catching the light, and said just two words, "Right here." She didn't know then that this man, this broken, haunted soul named Jonas Hale, would become her salvation, or that the manipulative businessman from her past would ride into town determined to destroy everything they'd built together. This is the story of two wounded hearts, one brutal winter, and the love that refused to let either of them disappear into the darkness. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach was gone. Mara Ellington stood in the center of Brimstone Ridge's only street, her traveling bag heavy in her trembling hands, and stared at the empty space where the westbound stage should have been waiting. The driver had told her in Silver Creek, told her specifically, that the coach would depart at 4 o'clock. She'd checked her father's pocket watch 3 times during the brutal 7-mile walk from where the previous stage had broken down. It was only 3:30, but the coach was gone, and the November sky was the color of old iron. "You looking for something, miss?" The voice came from behind her, tobacco rough and vaguely amused. Mara turned to find a stocky man in a stained leather apron standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a trading post. His eyes traveled up her frame, all 6 feet of it, and his expression shifted from curiosity to something closer to disbelief. "The stagecoach," Mara said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I was told it would leave at 4 o'clock. Left at 2:30. The man scratched his jaw. "Driver don't like to wait when a storm's coming. You're the new seamstress, I take it? For the Peterson place?" "Yes, Well, you missed it." He shrugged as if she'd simply missed her turn at cards. "Next coach won't come through for 5 days, maybe 6, depending on the weather." 5 days. Mara felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She had $17 to her name, no return ticket, and Mrs. Peterson was expecting her at the ranch tomorrow morning. The position had been promised, confirmed by letter 3 times. It was supposed to be her new beginning, her escape from everything she'd left behind in Philadelphia. "Is there—" Mara swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "Is there somewhere I might stay? A boarding house, or—" The man's expression shifted again, this time to something that made Mara's skin prickle with familiar dread. It was the look she'd seen 100 times before, the one that said she was too tall, too strange, too much of an oddity to be treated like a normal woman. "We got Widow March's place," he said slowly, "but she don't take in single women, says it ain't proper. And the saloon," he gestured vaguely down the street, "well, that ain't proper neither." "Then what do you suggest?" The words came out sharper than Mara intended, edged with the panic she was trying desperately to contain. The man stepped back into his store. "That's your concern, miss, not mine." The door closed with a definitive thud. Mara stood alone in the street as the first snowflakes began to fall. The next 2 hours were a lesson in humiliation. The trading post refused her. The general store owner, a thin woman with a pinched mouth, took one look at Mara's height and said her establishment was full up, despite the obviously empty rooms above the shop. The saloon keeper laughed outright when she asked about lodging, his gold tooth flashing in the dim light. "Honey, the only women who stay here got a different kind of work, if you take my meaning." She took his meaning. She left quickly. The church was locked, its elderly pastor apparently bedridden with winter illness, according to a passing farmer. The schoolhouse was too exposed, its windows broken. Even the livery stable owner, a kind-faced man who at least spoke to her with respect, explained that he couldn't offer his loft because his wife would never understand. And wasn't she worried about her reputation? Her reputation. Mara almost laughed at that. Her reputation had been destroyed the moment she'd walked away from Darren Cole's proposal 6 months ago. The moment she'd chosen dignity over security, freedom over gilded captivity. By the time the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Mara was shaking. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that stuck to her wool coat and melted into her hair. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour. She could feel it seeping through her layers, reaching for her bones. She found herself at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to scattered homesteads and empty land. Her feet had carried her there without conscious thought, driven by some animal instinct to find shelter, any shelter, before the storm truly hit. That's when she saw the cabin. It sat perhaps 50 yards off the main road, small and solid, with smoke rising from its stone chimney. Light glowed in the single window, warm and impossibly inviting. No fence, no sign, no indication of welcome or warning. Just a structure that represented survival. Mara stood in the falling snow and weighed her options. She could knock on that door and risk another rejection. Or she could try to make it back to town and search for some alcove, some covered space where she might survive until morning. She looked at the sky. It was nearly dark now, the clouds so heavy they seemed to press down on the earth. She walked toward the cabin. The man who answered her knock was not what she expected. He was tall, nearly as tall as she was, with broad shoulders that filled the door frame and hands that bore the calluses of hard labor. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined at the corners of his eyes and mouth, and his hair was dark brown shot through with gray. He might have been 40 or 50. It was hard to tell. He wore simple clothes, wool trousers, a faded work shirt, suspenders. His feet were bare despite the cold. But it was his eyes that struck her most. They were gray-blue, the color of a winter sky just before dawn, and they held a depth of weariness that Mara recognized immediately. This was a man who had lost something, perhaps many things. He looked at her in silence, those tired eyes taking in her height, her sodden coat, her desperate expression. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Mara began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I missed the stagecoach. There's nowhere in town that will take me. The storm is coming, and I have nowhere else to go. I can pay you. Not much, but I can work. I can come inside." The words were so quiet, so unexpected, that Mara wasn't sure she'd heard them correctly. "I said come inside." He stepped back from the door, his expression unchanged. "Before you freeze." Mara hesitated for only a heartbeat before stepping over the threshold. The warmth hit her like a physical force. The cabin was small, one room essentially with a sleeping loft visible above, but it was clean and well maintained. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the space with flickering light. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, shelves lined with supplies, and hooks near the door where coats and tools hung in careful order. The floor was bare wood, swept clean. It smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something else, something like loneliness made tangible. The man closed the door behind her, shutting out the wind. "You can put your bag down," he said, moving toward the stove. "I'll make coffee." Mara set her bag on the floor near the door, her hands still trembling. She couldn't tell if it was from cold or relief or the surreal quality of this moment. This stranger had let her in without question, without judgment, without even asking her name. "I'm Mara Ellington," she said, because it seemed important to establish something normal, something proper. "I'm supposed to work for the Peterson family, as a seamstress, but I missed the stage and Jonas Hale." He didn't turn from the stove where he was pouring water from a kettle into a battered tin pot. "The Petersons are good people. Storm should clear in a day or 2. You can head out to their place then." His voice was low and steady, with a hint of something that might have been a southern drawl, long since faded. He spoke the way people did when they'd grown unaccustomed to conversation, each word measured, considered, offered carefully. Mara watched him move around the small space with quiet efficiency. There was something almost formal about his movements, a kind of deliberate restraint that suggested he was being very careful not to frighten her. It occurred to her that this man, this Jonas Hale, understood exactly how vulnerable she was, how much trust she was placing in him by stepping into his home. "Why did you help me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Jonas paused in his work, his back still to her. For a long moment he didn't answer, then, "It's going to be a bad storm. Nobody deserves to freeze." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was all she was going to get. They drank the coffee in silence. Mara sat at the table, her coat finally removed and hung by the door, her hands wrapped around the warm tin cup. Jonas sat across from her, his own cup held loosely in his calloused fingers. He didn't ask her questions, didn't make small talk, didn't stare at her height or make awkward comments about the impropriety of their situation. He simply sat, his gaze fixed on something beyond the walls of the cabin, and let the quiet fill the space between them. Outside, the storm arrived in earnest. Wind howled around the eaves, rattling the window in its frame. Snow hissed against the walls. The temperature inside the cabin seemed to drop just from proximity to all that cold. Jonas stood and moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. Sparks spiraled up the chimney. "You hungry?" Mara realized she was. She'd eaten nothing since a hard biscuit at dawn. "Yes, but I don't want to impose." "You're not." He opened a wooden box near the stove and pulled out strips of dried venison and a cloth-wrapped bundle that proved to be cornbread. He set them on the table between them, then fetched 2 plates from a shelf. "It's simple, but it's hot." They ate together in the firelight. The venison was salty and tough, the cornbread dense and slightly sweet. It was the best meal Mara had eaten in weeks. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, desperate to break the silence with something, anything. 8 years, built the cabin myself." "It's well made." Jonas nodded once, accepting the compliment without false modesty. "Keeps the wind out." "And before that?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Elsewhere." The word was a door closing. Mara didn't push. They finished eating. Jonas cleared the plates and set them in a basin near the stove. Then he stood by the fire, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Mara felt the question rising in her throat, the one she'd been avoiding since she stepped inside. Where should I sleep?" Jonas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his weathered face. Not attraction, not calculation, but recognition. As if he saw in her the same exhaustion, the same bone-deep weariness that he carried in himself. He walked to a wooden chest in the corner and pulled out 2 heavy quilts. He carried them to the hearth, spread one on the floor near the fire, and held the other in his hands. "Right here," he said quietly, gesturing to the makeshift bed he'd created. "You'll be warm. I'll sleep in the loft." Mara stared at him, at the blanket, at the completely unexpected kindness of this gesture. "I can't take your—" "You can?" Jonas placed the second quilt beside the first. "I've slept through worse storms in worse places. You need the warmth more than I do." "But, Miss Ellington." He met her eyes, and there was something fierce in his gaze now, something that allowed no argument. "This is my home, my rules, and the rule is, nobody freezes under my roof. Understand?" Mara nodded, her throat too tight for words. Jonas climbed the ladder to the loft without another word. Mara heard the creak of ropes as he settled into what must have been a bed up there, hidden in the shadows. She stood alone by the fire, staring at the blankets he'd laid out for her. This stranger had given her warmth, safety, dignity. He'd asked nothing in return, hadn't made her feel small or strange or unwanted, hadn't looked at her like she was a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be exploited. He'd simply pulled back a blanket and said, "Right here." Mara lowered herself onto the makeshift bed, pulling the quilts around her shoulders. The floor was hard beneath her, but the fire was warm, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. She felt safe. Mara woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment she was disoriented, her mind still tangled in dreams. Then she felt the hard floor beneath her, saw the stone hearth with its crackling fire, and remembered Jonas Hale's cabin, the storm, the blankets. She sat up quickly, embarrassment flooding through her. How long had she slept? The light streaming through the window was thin and gray, but it was definitely morning. She'd slept in a stranger's home, on his floor, wrapped in his blankets like a child. Jonas was at the stove, his back to her, cooking something in a cast-iron skillet. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, his suspenders hanging loose at his sides. His hair was slightly mussed, and there was a stillness to him that suggested he'd been awake for hours. "Morning," he said without turning. "Storm's still going. Won't let up until tonight, probably." Mara pushed the quilts aside and stood, feeling the stiffness in her back. "I'm sorry. I should have woken earlier." "Why?" The question caught her off guard. Because I'm imposing on your hospitality. The least I can do is—" "You're not imposing." Jonas turned from the stove, holding the skillet with a cloth. You needed shelter. I had shelter to give. That's the end of it. He gestured to the table. Sit. Eat. It wasn't a request. Mara sat. He placed a plate in front of her, bacon, fried potatoes, and a thick slice of toasted bread. Then he poured her coffee and set the cup beside the plate. He served himself and sat across from her, and they ate together in the same companionable silence as the night before. Mara studied him as she chewed. In the morning light she could see more details. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the scar that ran through his left eyebrow, the careful precision with which he moved. There was something almost military in his bearing, a sense of discipline that had been deeply ingrained. Were you a soldier? She asked. Jonas paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Long time ago. Which war? The one that mattered. He took a bite of bacon, chewing slowly. You ask a lot of questions. I'm curious about the man who saved my life. I didn't save your life. I gave you a warm place to sleep. In this storm? Mara gestured toward the window, where snow was still falling in thick, blinding sheets. That's the same thing. Jonas said nothing, but something flickered in his eyes. Acknowledgement, maybe, or discomfort at being praised. They finished eating. Mara insisted on washing the dishes, and Jonas didn't argue. She worked at the basin while he moved around the cabin, checking the fire, examining the window frame for leaks, occupying himself with the small tasks that filled a day. She noticed that he never quite looked at her directly, as if he was giving her space, respecting some invisible boundary. It was only when she'd dried the last plate that she realized he was being careful with her, deliberately, almost painfully careful. Mr. Hale, she began. Jonas. Jonas. The name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar and not familiar enough. I need to get word to Mrs. Peterson, to let her know I'm delayed. Is there a way to... Not until the storm clears. He was standing by the window now, gazing out at the white wall of snow. Can't even see the road. Anyone who tried to ride out in this would be dead in an hour. Mara felt a flutter of panic. But she's expecting me. She'll think I've abandoned the position. The Petersons know how storms work. They'll understand. You're sure? Jonas turned to look at her then, his gray-blue eyes steady. I'm sure. There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty, that made Mara believe him. This man knew the land, knew the weather, knew how people survived in places like this. Then I suppose I'm stuck here, she said, trying for lightness. Suppose you are. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Jonas crossed the room to the hearth and added another log. You keep apologizing for things that don't need apologies. Why is that? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Mara felt her defenses slam into place. I'm not... You are. He straightened, brushing bark from his hands. You apologize for existing, for taking up space, for needing help. He paused, his gaze heavy on her. Someone teach you that? Mara's breath caught in her chest. For a moment she was back in Philadelphia, standing in Darren Cole's parlor, listening to him explain, so patiently, so reasonably, that she needed to be less opinionated, less tall, less independent, that her value lay in shrinking herself to fit his vision of an acceptable wife. A lot of people taught me that, she said quietly. Jonas nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. Well, it's bullshit. The profanity, delivered in his low, measured voice, startled a laugh out of Mara. Excuse me? You heard me. Jonas moved to the table and began clearing away the breakfast dishes. You're tall. So what? You're a woman traveling alone. So what? You asked for help. That's not weakness. That's survival. Mara stared at him, this strange, weathered man who spoke with such absolute certainty about things she'd been taught to be ashamed of her entire life. You don't know me, she said, though there was no anger in it. Don't need to. I know people who've been beaten down, and I know people who are still standing despite it. He met her eyes. You're still standing. Something in Mara's chest cracked open, just slightly, just enough to let a small sliver of light in. Thank you, she whispered. Jonas turned away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Storm should break by evening. We'll get word to the Petersons tomorrow. And until then? He gestured vaguely around the cabin. You're welcome to whatever's here, books on the shelf, cards in the drawer, or just rest. You look like you need it. He was right. She was exhausted, bone-tired in a way that had nothing to do with one night's sleep. The weight of the last 6 months, the escape from Philadelphia, the constant worry about money, the grinding uncertainty of her future, had settled into her body like stones. I might read, if you don't mind, she said. Help yourself. Mara moved to the bookshelf and examined the small collection. A Bible, a few dime novels, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and surprisingly, a medical text on field surgery. She pulled out the Shakespeare and settled into one of the chairs near the fire. Jonas climbed up to the loft, returning a moment later with a piece of wood and a knife. He sat at the table and began to carve, his movements slow and precise. Shavings curled away from the blade, falling in soft spirals to the floor. They spent the day like that. Mara reading, Jonas carving, the storm howling outside, the fire crackling between them. It was comfortable in a way that Mara hadn't experienced with another person in longer than she could remember. There was no expectation of conversation, no social performance required. Just two people occupying the same space, keeping each other company in silence. At some point, Mara dozed off, the book slipping from her hands. When she woke, there was a blanket draped over her shoulders, and Jonas was at the stove preparing supper. The evening meal was venison stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, served with more of the dense cornbread. They ate together as the last light faded from the window, the cabin growing dark except for the glow of the fire. Tell me about the Petersons, Mara said as she scraped her bowl clean. Jonas considered the question while he chewed. Good people. Fair employers. They run cattle mostly, but Mrs. Peterson likes things done proper. Brought in a piano last year, had it hauled all the way from Denver. He paused. She'll be glad to have a seamstress. She's been trying to do the mending herself, but her hands shake now. Age, probably. And Mr. Peterson? Decent man. Works hard. Expects the same from others, but he pays fair and doesn't cheat. Jonas set down his spoon. You'll do well there. You seem certain of that. You're a hard worker, I can tell. Mara tilted her head, curious. How? Your hands. He nodded toward where her fingers rested on the table. They're a seamstress's hands, needle scars on the fingertips, calluses in specific places. You've been sewing for years. That takes discipline. Mara looked down at her hands, seeing them through his eyes. It was true. Her fingers bore the marks of her trade, the tiny scars and toughened skin that came from thousands of hours with needle and thread. I started when I was 7, she said quietly. My mother taught me. She said a woman with a skill would never starve. She was right. She died when I was 15, cholera. I'm sorry. The words were simple, but they held genuine sympathy. Mara found herself continuing, words spilling out that she hadn't intended to share. My father remarried quickly, a woman with 3 sons of her own. She didn't care for me much. I was too tall, too awkward. I reminded her too much of my mother. Mara's fingers tightened around her cup. When my father died 2 years later, she made it clear I wasn't welcome in the house. So I worked. Sewed for anyone who would pay. Lived in boarding houses. Made my own way. That's hard. It was. Mara looked up at him. But it taught me I could survive alone. Jonas nodded slowly, and she saw recognition in his eyes again. Alone's not always by choice. No, Mara agreed. It's not. The question hung between them, unspoken. What made you alone? But Jonas didn't offer his story, and Mara didn't push. They'd both shared enough for one night. After supper, Jonas insisted on doing the dishes himself. Mara settled by the fire again, watching the flames dance, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. The storm outside had finally begun to ease. The wind was less fierce, the snow falling more gently. By morning, Jonas had said, it would be clear enough to travel. By morning, she would leave this cabin and this strange, kind man behind. The thought brought an unexpected pang of loss. Mr. Hale, Jonas, she said suddenly, why do you live out here alone? He was putting away the last of the dishes, his back to her, his shoulders tensed. Same reason as you, probably, he said after a long moment. Needed to be somewhere nobody knew me. What were you running from? Jonas turned to face her, and there was something raw in his expression, something he immediately tried to hide. Ghosts. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Mara understood. She had her own ghosts, her dead parents, her bitter stepmother, and Darren Cole with his controlling hands and his suffocating expectations. Some ghosts followed you no matter how far you ran. Do you ever stop running? She asked quietly. Jonas looked at her for a long time, his gray-blue eyes reflecting the firelight. I don't know. Haven't stopped yet. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her. They prepared for sleep, Jonas laying out the blankets by the fire again, Mara changing into her nightdress behind a blanket he'd strung up for privacy. When she emerged, he was already climbing the ladder to the loft. Jonas, she called. He paused, looking down at her. Thank you for everything. He nodded once. Sleep well, Mara. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She lay down on the blankets, pulling them around her, and stared up at the ceiling. Somewhere above her, Jonas settled into his own bed. The fire crackled. The wind whispered against the walls, gentle now, almost peaceful. Mara closed her eyes and wondered what it would be like to stay here, to wake up every morning to this quiet man and his careful kindness, to build a life in this small cabin at the edge of nowhere. But that was a foolish thought. She had a position waiting at the Peterson Ranch, a new beginning, a chance to finally be more than just a woman running from her past. Still, as she drifted towards sleep, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that she was leaving something important behind. Eat. Morning arrived cold and clear. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Everything was white, clean, perfect. Jonas was already awake, already dressed, already stoking the fire. He moved through his morning routine with the same quiet efficiency, and Mara watched him while pretending not to, memorizing the shape of him in the early light. Breakfast was quick, porridge with molasses and strong coffee. They ate without much conversation, both of them aware that this was goodbye. After the meal, Jonas went outside to check the road. He returned a few minutes later, brushing snow from his coat. Road's passable if you're careful. I can walk you to town. You don't have to. I'm walking you to town. His tone left no room for argument. Mara gathered her things, folding the blankets carefully, leaving them in a neat stack by the hearth. She pulled on her coat and picked up her bag, feeling the weight of departure settle on her shoulders. Jonas held the door open for her, and they stepped out into the brilliant white morning. The walk to town took 30 minutes. The snow was deep in places, and Jonas led the way, breaking a path for her to follow. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said, and the silence between them felt too fragile to break. Brimstone Ridge looked different in daylight, almost pretty under its blanket of snow. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few people were out, shoveling paths, tending to animals. They stared openly at Mara and Jonas walking together, and Mara saw the speculation in their eyes. Jonas ignored them all. He walked her straight to the trading post where the proprietor from yesterday stood sweeping snow from his porch. Peterson Place sent a rider this morning, the man called out, looking for their seamstress. I told them you'd probably frozen to death. She didn't. Jonas's voice was flat, hard, and she'll be ready to go when they send someone. The man's eyes widened slightly. Everyone in town knew Jonas Hale, apparently, and everyone knew not to cross him. I'll let them know, the man said quickly. Jonas nodded. Then he turned to Mara, his expression carefully neutral. You'll be all right? Yes. The word came out more forcefully than she intended. Thank you for everything. Take care of yourself, Miss Ellington. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching in the snow, his shoulders square against the cold. Mara watched him go, this man who had given her shelter, who had treated her with more kindness than she'd received in years, who had asked nothing in return. She wanted to call out to him, to say something more, to make him understand how much these 2 days had meant. But Jonas Hale was already disappearing down the street, a dark figure against all that white, heading back to his cabin at the edge of town, heading back to his ghosts. And Mara stood alone in front of the trading post, her bag in her hand, and wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life by not asking him to stay. The Peterson Ranch sprawled across a valley 15 miles west of Brimstone Ridge, its main house a sturdy two-story structure flanked by barns, corrals, and workers' quarters. When the ranch hand arrived to collect Mara that afternoon, she climbed into the wagon with her bag and didn't look back at the town. She especially didn't look toward the edge of town where a small cabin sat, its chimney sending up a thin ribbon of smoke into the winter sky. Mrs. Peterson turned out to be exactly as Jonas had described, a woman of perhaps 60 with silver hair pinned severely back, hands that trembled slightly when she lifted her teacup, and eyes that missed nothing. She walked Mara through the house with brisk efficiency, pointing out the sewing room that had been prepared on the second floor, the quarters Mara would occupy in the west wing, and the basket of mending that had accumulated over the past 6 months. "I don't expect miracles," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice crisp as winter air. "But I do expect quality work and discretion. My husband and I value privacy, Miss Ellington. What happens in this house stays in this house. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, ma'am." "Good." Mrs. Peterson's stern expression softened slightly. "I heard you were stranded in town during the storm. Where did you shelter?" Mara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. A local resident offered assistance. Jonas Hale. It wasn't a question. Mrs. Peterson's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "He's a good man. Too much sadness in him, but good nonetheless. You were fortunate." "Yes, ma'am." "Now then, let's see what you can do with this." Mrs. Peterson pulled a damaged dress from the mending basket, its hem torn and its bodice missing 2 buttons. "Mr. Peterson is hosting a territorial meeting here in 3 weeks. I'll need this repaired along with everything else in that basket, plus 3 new shirts for my husband. Can you manage?" Mara examined the dress, her fingers automatically assessing the work required. "Yes, ma'am. Easily." "Then you'd better get started." The days that followed fell into a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Mara rose before dawn, took her breakfast in the kitchen with the ranch hands, and climbed the stairs to her sewing room as the sun broke over the mountains. She worked until her eyes ached, her fingers moving with the practiced precision of years, transforming torn fabric and missing buttons into garments that looked almost new. Mrs. Peterson checked on her progress twice daily, offering occasional praise and frequent criticism, but always fair in her assessment. The work was everything Mara had hoped for. The pay was decent. The quarters were comfortable. Mrs. Peterson treated her with the respect due a skilled professional, not a charity case or an oddity to be whispered about. And yet, Mara found her mind wandering. She would be pinning a hem and suddenly remember the way Jonas had handed her coffee without asking if she wanted it, simply knowing she did. She would be threading a needle and recall the careful way he'd laid out blankets by the fire, creating warmth and safety without expecting anything in return. She would look out the window at the snow-covered valley and wonder what he was doing in his cabin at the edge of town, alone with his ghosts. It was foolish. She barely knew the man. They'd spent less than 2 days together, and yet something about Jonas Hale had burrowed under her skin and refused to leave. On the 4th day, Mrs. Peterson's pastor arrived for afternoon tea. Reverend Thomas was a frail man in his 70s, his face weathered by decades of frontier life, his hands shaking worse than Mrs. Peterson's. His wife accompanied him, a small, bird-like woman named Eleanor, who spoke in a whisper and smiled apologetically whenever her husband coughed, which was often. "My husband is dying," Eleanor said matter-of-factly when Mrs. Peterson stepped away to fetch more tea. She was sitting in the sewing room, watching Mara work on a shirt collar. "The doctor says it's his lungs. Maybe 6 months. Maybe less." Mara's hands stilled on the fabric. "I'm very sorry." "Don't be. We've had 40 good years together. That's more than most people get." Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of Mara's work table. "But I worry about what will happen after. The church will need a new pastor, and the congregation is small. We barely have funds to maintain the building." She paused, her sharp eyes fixed on Mara. "Your sewing is beautiful." "Thank you." "I wonder, would you consider taking on work outside the ranch? Private commissions? There are women in town who would pay well for skilled seamstress work. And I'm afraid I have several dresses that need attention. My hands aren't what they used to be." Mara looked up from her work, considering. "Mrs. Peterson had said nothing about taking outside jobs, but she also hadn't forbidden it. And the extra income would be useful, especially if she wanted to save enough to eventually establish her own shop. "I'd be happy to help you," Mara said carefully, "though I'd need to confirm with Mrs. Peterson first." "Of course." Eleanor smiled, and there was something knowing in that smile, something that suggested she understood more than she was saying. "Perhaps you could come to town on Sunday, after services. We could discuss the work then. I'll ask Mrs. Peterson." Mrs. Peterson, when approached, was surprisingly agreeable. "As long as it doesn't interfere with your work here, I have no objection. In fact, it might be good for you to establish connections in town. You'll need them if you ever want to set up your own business." She fixed Mara with a penetrating stare. "That is your goal, isn't it? Your own shop?" "Eventually, yes." "Good. Ambition is nothing to be ashamed of, Miss Ellington. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." And so on Sunday morning, Mara rode into Brimstone Ridge in the ranch wagon, a basket of mending on her lap and a flutter of nervousness in her chest that had nothing to do with church services or business arrangements. She told herself she wasn't hoping to see Jonas Hale. Told herself it didn't matter if he attended services or not, if he was in town or staying isolated in his cabin. Told herself she was being ridiculous for thinking about a man she'd known for less than 48 hours. But when she stepped into the small wooden church and her eyes swept the congregation, she was looking for him anyway. He wasn't there. The service was simple and sincere, led by the dying Reverend Thomas with his wife at the piano, her thin fingers coaxing hymns from the battered instrument. The congregation was small, maybe 30 people, mostly ranch families and townspeople, their voices blending in songs Mara remembered from her childhood. She sat in the back, aware of the curious glances thrown her way, the whispered speculation about the new seamstress at the Peterson ranch. Afterward, Eleanor Thomas approached with a warm smile and a gentle touch on Mara's arm. "Come to the parsonage. We'll discuss the work, and I'll make tea." The parsonage sat behind the church, a modest house that clearly hadn't seen proper maintenance in years. The roof sagged in one corner. The windows needed caulking. Inside, the furniture was old but clean, and the air smelled of camphor and illness. Eleanor served tea in chipped china cups and showed Mara 3 dresses that needed extensive repair. They discussed terms, fair payment, reasonable timeline, and Eleanor wrote everything down in a careful hand. "You're very talented," Eleanor said as she watched Mara examine the stitching on a torn hem. "Where did you learn?" "My mother. She was a seamstress in Philadelphia." "And what brought you all the way out here, if you don't mind my asking?" Mara hesitated. She'd learned to be careful with her story, to reveal only what was necessary. But something about Eleanor's kind eyes and gentle demeanor made her want to be honest. "I needed a new start," she said simply. "The old life wasn't working anymore." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Sometimes the only way forward is to leave everything behind. I understand that." She poured more tea. "Jonas Hale understands it too." Mara's head snapped up. "What?" "Jonas." Eleanor's smile was sad. "He's the same way, running from something too painful to face, though I think he's been running so long he's forgotten how to stop. I barely know Mr. Hale." "But you stayed in his cabin during the storm." "That's more than most people in this town have managed. Jonas doesn't let people in. Not since—" Eleanor trailed off, her expression clouding. "Not since what?" Eleanor studied Mara for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. "I suppose you'll hear it eventually. Might as well hear the truth." She set down her teacup. "Jonas used to live in Colorado. He had a wife, Sarah, and a little girl. Emma, I think her name was. Maybe 5 years old. There was a fever one winter. Scarlet fever. It swept through their town. Sarah and Emma both got sick." Mara felt her chest tighten. "Jonas nursed them for 3 weeks, barely slept, did everything he could, but they died anyway, within hours of each other." Eleanor's voice was soft with sorrow. "After that, Jonas couldn't stay in that town. He sold everything, took odd jobs, drifted for a few years. Then one day he showed up here and built that cabin at the edge of town. Been here 8 years now, and in all that time, I don't think I've heard him speak more than a dozen words at a time." That's terrible, Mara whispered. It gets worse. Eleanor leaned forward. About a year after he settled here, Jonas was driving a wagon to Silver Creek for supplies. On his way back, he came across an overturned wagon on the road. A family, husband, wife, 2 children. The wagon had slipped on ice, rolled down an embankment. The husband was already dead. The wife was dying. Jonas stayed with her, tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much damage. She begged him to save her children, but by the time help arrived, they were gone too. All of them dead, and Jonas was the only one there to witness it. Mara's hand covered her mouth. He blamed himself. Said if he'd come along the road 5 minutes earlier, he might have warned them about the ice. Or if he'd been a better field surgeon, he learned some medicine during the war. He might have saved them. Of course, none of that was true, but grief doesn't listen to logic. Eleanor's eyes were damp. After that, Jonas withdrew completely. He helps people when they need it. He's not cruel, but he doesn't get close to anyone, doesn't attend church, doesn't socialize, just works his land and keeps to himself. And the town lets him? The town respects him. Jonas Hale is a man who's been broken by loss, but he hasn't become bitter or mean. He still has kindness in him. That's rare out here, Miss Ellington. That's worth protecting. Mara sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. Suddenly, everything about Jonas made sense. His careful distance, his measured words, the way he'd given her shelter but kept himself separate. He was a man afraid to let anyone close, terrified that whatever he touched would die. He let me stay in his cabin, Mara said quietly. He gave me his blankets, made me feel safe. Then you were lucky, Eleanor smiled. Or maybe Jonas was. Maybe you were exactly what he needed to see, that helping someone doesn't always end in tragedy. They finished their tea in contemplative silence. Mara gathered the dresses and promised to have them repaired within 2 weeks. Eleanor walked her to the door, then paused with her hand on the latch. Miss Ellington, may I give you some advice? Of course. This town can be hard on women who don't fit the mold. You're tall, you're unmarried, you're independent. People will talk, they'll make assumptions, some of them will be unkind. Eleanor's grip tightened on the door handle. But don't let them make you small. Don't let them convince you that needing help or accepting kindness makes you weak. And if you find something, or someone, worth fighting for, fight. Because regret is a heavier burden than risk. Mara looked into Eleanor's weathered face and saw a lifetime of wisdom there, earned through hardship and loss. Thank you, she said softly. Come back next Sunday. I'll introduce you to some of the other women, help you build connections. Eleanor smiled. You're going to do well here, Miss Ellington. I can feel it. Mara walked back through town toward where the Peterson wagon waited, Eleanor's dresses bundled in her arms. The main street was quiet, most people home for Sunday dinner. But as she passed the general store, she heard her name spoken in a harsh whisper. That's her. The one who stayed with Jonas Hale. Mara turned to see 3 women clustered on the store's porch, their faces pinched with disapproval. She recognized the thin woman from the general store, the one who'd turned her away during the storm. 2 days alone with a man. Shameful. This from a heavy-set woman in a bonnet. What did she expect? A woman that tall, traveling alone? She's probably... Good afternoon, ladies. Mara's voice cut through their gossip like a knife. I'm Mara Ellington. Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts with me directly? The women's faces flushed red. The store owner stammered something unintelligible, but the heavy-set woman lifted her chin defiantly. We're just saying what everyone's thinking. A decent woman wouldn't impose herself on a bachelor like that. A decent woman wouldn't freeze to death rather than accept help from a good man. Mara stepped closer, her height suddenly an advantage as she looked down at the shorter women. Jonas Hale treated me with more respect and kindness than anyone else in this town. He gave me shelter during a blizzard and asked nothing in return. If that offends your sense of propriety, then perhaps your propriety needs examining. Well, I never... No, I don't suppose you have. Mara adjusted the bundle in her arms. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. She walked away with her head high, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, she heard the women's scandalized whispers, but she didn't care. Let them talk. Let them judge. She'd spent too many years apologizing for existing, making herself smaller to fit other people's expectations. Jonas had been right. It was bullshit. The ride back to the Peterson ranch felt longer than usual. Mara sat in the wagon bed, watching the town disappear behind her, and felt a strange mixture of anger and determination settling in her bones. She'd come west to build a new life, to escape the suffocating expectations of Philadelphia and Darren Cole's controlling grip. She wasn't about to let a handful of small-minded gossips make her feel ashamed for surviving. But as the ranch came into view, she couldn't stop thinking about what Eleanor had said. About Jonas and his ghosts. About the family he'd lost and the one he'd failed to save. About a man so hollowed out by grief that he'd forgotten how to live. She wondered if he ever thought about their 2 days together. If he remembered the way she'd looked at him over coffee, the comfortable silence they'd shared. Or if she was just another person passing through his life, barely worth remembering. That night, lying in her comfortable bed at the ranch, Mara made a decision. She would finish Eleanor's dresses. She would build her reputation in Brimstone Ridge. She would save her money and work toward her dream of her own shop. And she would find a way to see Jonas Hale again. Not because she owed him anything, not because she needed his protection, but because something had passed between them in that cabin, some recognition, some understanding, and she wasn't ready to let it disappear into silence. The weeks that followed were a blur of needle and thread. Mara worked from dawn until her eyes burned, completing the Peterson mending and starting on Eleanor's dresses. She developed a routine, 5 days at the ranch, focused entirely on Mrs. Peterson's needs, and then Sunday trips to town for church services and private commissions. Word spread quickly about the new seamstress's skill. Women began approaching her after services, asking if she took private work. Mara's Sunday afternoons filled with consultations and fittings, her evenings with cutting and pinning. She kept meticulous records, saved every penny she could spare, and felt her dream of independence slowly becoming real. But she didn't see Jonas. She looked for him every Sunday, scanned the congregation during services, watched the street afterward, found excuses to walk past his cabin. But the door was always closed, the windows dark except for the thin trail of smoke from the chimney that proved someone was still alive inside. It was Eleanor who finally brought news of him. Jonas came by the parsonage yesterday, she mentioned casually one Sunday afternoon, 4 weeks after Mara's arrival. Brought firewood. He does that sometimes, chops extra wood and leaves it for families who need it. Mara's hand stilled on the dress she was hemming. Did he say anything? Asked about you, actually. Eleanor's eyes twinkled. Wanted to know if you'd made it to the Peterson ranch safely, if you were settling in well. What did you tell him? The truth. That you're working hard, building a reputation, and standing up to gossips with more spine than half the men in this town. Eleanor smiled. He seemed pleased to hear it. Mara bent her head over her work, trying to hide the warmth flooding her cheeks. Jonas had asked about her, had cared enough to check if she was all right. Did he say anything else? Just that he was glad you were safe. Eleanor paused. Mara, dear, may I ask you something? What are your feelings toward Jonas Hale? The question hung in the air between them. Mara set down her needle and looked out the parsonage window, gathering her thoughts. I don't know, she said honestly. I barely know him, but I can't stop thinking about those 2 days, about how he made me feel seen, not judged, not measured against some impossible standard, just seen. She turned back to Eleanor. Is that foolish? Not at all. Sometimes the shortest encounters leave the deepest marks. Eleanor reached across and squeezed Mara's hand. But Jonas is a complicated man. His grief has built walls that might be impossible to climb. I know. And this town won't make it easy for either of you. The gossip is already unkind. I don't care about gossip. But Jonas might. He's already lost so much. He might be afraid to risk caring for someone again, afraid that his caring might somehow bring harm. Mara understood what Eleanor wasn't saying, that Jonas might push her away precisely because he felt drawn to her, because anything he cared about seemed to die. Then what should I do? Mara asked. Eleanor smiled gently. Live your life. Build your business. Be the woman you want to be. And if Jonas Hale is meant to be part of that life, he'll find his way to you. But don't put your own dreams on hold waiting for a man to heal himself. That's a wait that might never end. The advice was sound. Mara knew it was sound. And yet, as she rode back to the ranch that evening, Eleanor's repaired dresses delivered and a pocket full of payment, she couldn't help looking toward the edge of town where Jonas's cabin sat. The door remained closed, the windows dark. But as the wagon passed, Mara could have sworn she saw a shadow move behind the curtain, a figure standing at the window, watching her leave. She turned forward again, her heart beating faster, and wondered if Jonas Hale was finding it just as hard to forget their 2 days together as she was. The territorial meeting that Mrs. Peterson had mentioned arrived with little warning and tremendous fuss. Mr. Peterson, a stern man with a gray beard and commanding presence, rode in from the range with a dozen other ranchers and businessmen, their voices loud with debate about railroad rights and water access and territorial politics. The house filled with cigar smoke and masculine energy, and Mrs. Peterson moved through it all with the grace of a woman accustomed to hosting power. Mara stayed in her sewing room, finishing the last of Mr. Peterson's shirts. But on the second evening of the meeting, Mrs. Peterson knocked on her door with an unusual request. "Miss Ellington, I need you to join us for dinner tonight." Mara looked up in surprise. "Ma'am?" "We're 3 women short at the table, and I won't have an unbalanced seating arrangement. You'll sit between Judge Crawford and Mr. Morrison. Just smile, nod, and don't express any political opinions. Can you manage that?" It wasn't really a request. Mara set aside her sewing and reached for her best dress, a deep blue wool that her mother had made years ago, altered now to fit Mara's height and figure. The dinner was exactly as uncomfortable as she'd anticipated. The men talked over her, around her, occasionally through her. Judge Crawford was 70 if he was a day, his breath sour with whiskey. Mr. Morrison was younger, but no more pleasant, his eyes lingering on Mara's neckline in a way that made her skin crawl. She endured it with quiet dignity, speaking only when spoken to, offering no opinions on matters she supposedly couldn't understand. But she listened, and what she heard troubled her. "The railroad's coming through whether we like it or not," one rancher was saying. "Question is, do we negotiate fair compensation now, or do we wait for them to seize the land through eminent domain?" "They can't just take our land," another protested. "They can and they will. Government's behind them. This is progress, gentlemen. Either get on board or get run over." "What about the homesteaders, the small landowners?" "What about them?" This from Mr. Morrison, his voice dismissive. "Most of them barely have legal title anyway. Squatters, half of them. The railroad will offer pennies, and they'll take it because they've got no choice." Mara thought immediately of Jonas's cabin at the edge of town. Was his land in the railroad's path? Did he even know they were coming? The conversation shifted to water rights, then to territorial politics, then back to the railroad. Through it all, Mara caught fragments of information: survey routes, planned expansion, strategic acquisitions. The men spoke carelessly, assuming she was too simple or too female to understand or remember. They were wrong on both counts. After dinner, as the men retired to Mr. Peterson's study for brandy and cigars, Mrs. Peterson pulled Mara aside. "You did well tonight." "Thank you, ma'am." "I saw you listening. You're sharp." Sharper than most of those men realize. Mrs. Peterson's eyes were knowing. "What you heard tonight, the railroad plans, the land acquisitions, that information could be valuable to the right people. Small landowners who might want to prepare, negotiate better terms." "Are you suggesting I share what I heard?" "I'm suggesting that information is power, Miss Ellington, and women in our position don't often get access to power. What you do with what you've learned is your own business." Mrs. Peterson patted her arm. "Now go get some rest. You've earned it." Mara climbed the stairs to her room, her mind churning. Should she warn Jonas? Was it her place to interfere? They weren't friends. Not really. They'd shared 2 days and a handful of conversations. He might resent her presumption. But then she remembered his kindness, the blankets by the fire, the quiet certainty with which he'd said, "Nobody deserves to freeze." She would warn him, not because she expected anything in return, but because kindness deserved to be repaid with kindness. The question was how. The opportunity came sooner than Mara expected. 3 days after the territorial meeting, Mrs. Peterson announced she needed supplies from town and asked if Mara would mind making the trip to place orders at the general store. Take the small wagon, Mrs. Peterson said, her eyes sharp with understanding. And if you need to conduct any personal business while you're there, take your time. Mara wondered how much the older woman had guessed about her intentions, but she simply nodded and gathered her coat. The November morning was cold but clear, the sky that brilliant blue that only appeared after the first snows. Mara drove the wagon into Brimstone Ridge with her heart beating faster than the journey warranted. She told herself it was just common decency, warning a man about potential threats to his land, nothing more than neighborly concern. She told herself this lie all the way to the edge of town, where Jonas's cabin sat quiet in the morning light. Mara pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and sat there for a long moment, gathering her courage. What if he didn't want to see her? What if he thought she was presumptuous, interfering where she had no right? What if the kindness he'd shown during the storm had been nothing more than basic human decency, not an invitation for continued connection? She climbed down from the wagon before she could talk herself out of it. The knock echoed hollowly against the wooden door. For a moment there was only silence, and Mara felt foolish standing there in the cold. Then she heard movement inside, footsteps approaching, and the door swung open. Jonas stood in the doorway, and Mara's breath caught in her chest. He looked exactly as she remembered, weathered face, gray-blue eyes, that stillness that suggested deep waters running beneath a calm surface. He wore a simple work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and there was sawdust in his hair, as if she'd interrupted him in the middle of some project. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. "Miss Ellington," Jonas said finally, his voice as low and careful as she remembered. "Jonas." His name felt natural on her tongue. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I need to tell you something." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or wariness. "Come inside." The cabin looked the same as it had 6 weeks ago, though there were small changes. A new shelf on the wall, a pile of carved wooden figures on the table that hadn't been there before. The fire crackled in the hearth, warming the space. It smelled of pine shavings and coffee, familiar and oddly comforting. Jonas closed the door and turned to face her, waiting. Mara took a breath and plunged in. "I was at the Peterson Ranch when Mr. Peterson hosted a territorial meeting. Ranchers and businessmen discussing the railroad expansion. Jonas, they're planning to extend the line through this area. They talked about acquiring land, making offers to small landowners. Some of them said the railroad would use eminent domain if they had to." Jonas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "When?" "They didn't give exact dates, but soon. Within the year, I think. I thought you should know, in case your land is in their path, in case you need to prepare." "Why are you telling me this?" The question wasn't hostile, just genuinely curious. Mara met his eyes steadily. "Because you helped me when I needed it, and because I think you deserve fair warning, not some railroad man showing up at your door with an ultimatum." Jonas studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Thank you. That was kind of you. It was just information. Information's valuable. You didn't have to share it." "I wanted to." The words came out more intense than Mara intended, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. I mean, it seemed like the right thing to do. Something shifted in Jonas's expression, a softening around his eyes. "Would you like coffee?" The offer surprised her. "I don't want to impose—" "You're not." Jonas moved toward the stove, and Mara caught the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Besides, you look half frozen. How long were you standing outside before you knocked?" "Not long." "You're a terrible liar, Miss Ellington." Despite herself, Mara laughed. "Mara, please. After I slept on your floor, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Mara, then." Jonas poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. "How are you settling in at the Peterson place?" "Well, Mrs. Peterson is demanding but fair. The work is steady." Mara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "And I've started taking private commissions. Eleanor Thomas has been introducing me to other women in town." "Eleanor's good people. She told me about your wife, your daughter." "I'm so sorry, Jonas." The words hung in the air between them. Jonas's hand tightened on his cup, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "She shouldn't have told you that." "Maybe not, but I'm glad she did. It helps me understand." "Understand what?" Why you live out here alone? Why you're so careful with people? Mara set down her cup and took a step closer. Why you gave me shelter but kept yourself distant. You're afraid that caring about people brings them harm. Jonas's eyes snapped to hers, and for the first time she saw real emotion there, pain, anger, and something that might have been fear. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Jonas, you blame yourself for deaths that weren't your fault. Your wife and daughter died of fever. That wasn't your doing. And that family on the road, you couldn't have saved them. You tried, but some things are beyond anyone's control. You weren't there. His voice was hard now, edged with something dangerous. You don't know what I could have done differently. You're right. I wasn't there. But I know grief. I know what it's like to blame yourself for things you couldn't prevent. Mara felt her own pain rising, words she'd never spoken aloud tumbling out. My mother died of cholera when I was 15. For years, I wondered if I could have saved her if I'd just been smarter, if I'd known more about medicine, if I'd prayed harder. But the truth is, she was going to die no matter what I did. The cholera didn't care about my prayers or my wishes. It just took her. Jonas turned away, his shoulders rigid. That's different. How? How is it different? Because I'm trained. I was a field surgeon in the war. I've cut bullets out of men, sewn up wounds that should have been fatal. I should have been able to save them. You're not God, Jonas. You're just a man, a good man who did everything he could. It wasn't enough. The words came out raw, broken. It's never enough. Mara wanted to touch him, to offer some physical comfort, but she sensed that would be too much. Instead, she stayed where she was and spoke softly. Eleanor also told me that you still help people, that you chop firewood for families who need it, that you stepped in to give a stranger shelter during a storm. If you really believed you brought harm to everyone you touched, you wouldn't do those things. Jonas was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah used to say, I had too much guilt in me, that I carried other people's pain like it was my own. He turned back to face Mara, and his eyes were damp. Maybe she was right. Maybe I've been carrying death so long I've forgotten how to carry anything else. Then maybe it's time to put some of it down. I don't know how. Neither do I. But maybe we could figure it out together. The offer hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Jonas looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Why would you want that? You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're kind. I know you're honorable. I know you made me feel safe when I was terrified and alone. Mara took a breath. And I know that in the 6 weeks since I left this cabin, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. Jonas's expression cracked just slightly. Mara, I'm not asking for anything you can't give. I'm not expecting declarations or promises. But I am asking if maybe we could be friends. If maybe you could let me visit sometimes, bring you news from town, share coffee like this. She smiled tentatively. Unless you'd rather I leave you alone. I don't want you to leave me alone. The words came out fierce, almost angry. That's the problem. I should want that. I should send you away, tell you to find some young rancher or businessman who can give you a normal life. But I don't want to. God help me. I want you to keep coming back. Mara's heart hammered in her chest. Then I will. People will talk. Let them. I've already been the subject of their gossip. I'm not afraid of it. I am. Jonas's voice was rough with emotion. I'm afraid they'll make your life harder. I'm afraid my reputation, or lack of one, will damage yours. My reputation can handle it, and frankly, Jonas, your reputation is better than you think. Eleanor says people respect you. Eleanor's kind. Eleanor's honest. Mara moved closer, closing the distance between them. Let me be your friend. Let me visit. Let me bring you news and arguments and terrible coffee if that's what it takes. Just don't push me away because you're afraid. Jonas looked down at her, his gray-blue eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. Finally, he nodded. All right, but on one condition. What's that? My coffee isn't terrible. Mara laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the quiet cabin. No, it's not. It's actually quite good. Damn right it is. Jonas's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. Now sit down and finish yours before it gets cold, and tell me more about these railroad plans. They sat at the small table, just as they had 6 weeks ago, and talked. Mara shared everything she'd overheard at the territorial meeting, the survey routes, the planned timeline, the ruthless efficiency with which the railroad intended to acquire land. Jonas listened with the focused intensity of a man assessing a threat, asking occasional questions, his strategic mind clearly working through possibilities and contingencies. "My land isn't in their direct path," he said finally, "but it's close enough that they might want it for a work camp or supply depot. I need to check my title, make sure everything's in order." "Do you have a lawyer?" "No. Never needed one before." "Mrs. Peterson might know someone. I could ask." Jonas met her eyes. "You'd do that?" "Of course. That's what friends do." The word settled between them, friends, and Mara saw Jonas turning it over in his mind, testing it like unfamiliar territory. But he didn't reject it. "I'd appreciate that," he said finally. They talked for another hour about everything and nothing. Mara told him about her work, about the women she was meeting in town, about her slowly growing dream of her own shop. Jonas told her about his land, about the improvements he was planning, about a wolf pack that had been spotted near the Peterson ranch. It was comfortable conversation, easy in a way Mara hadn't experienced with anyone in years. Finally, reluctantly, Mara stood. "I should go. Mrs. Peterson's expecting supplies, and if I don't make it to the general store, she'll send a search party." Jonas rose as well, walking her to the door. "Thank you for the warning about the railroad and for—" He paused, struggling with words. "For everything else." "You're welcome. Can I come back?" "Sunday, after church. If you want." "I want—" Mara pulled on her coat, then turned back to face him. "Jonas, one more thing." "What?" "Stop believing that caring about people brings them harm. Because I care about you, and I'm not going anywhere." Before he could respond, before she could lose her nerve, Mara stepped out into the cold morning and climbed into the wagon. She didn't look back as she drove away, but she felt Jonas's eyes on her the entire time. The general store was busy when Mara arrived, full of townspeople conducting their weekly business. She placed Mrs. Peterson's orders with the proprietor, still as unfriendly as ever, and was turning to leave when she nearly collided with a woman entering the store. "I'm so sorry," Mara began, then stopped as she recognized the thin woman from the general store, one of the gossips who'd been discussing her so unkindly weeks earlier. The woman's eyes widened. "Miss Ellington. Mrs. Brennan." Mara kept her voice polite but cool. "I heard you were doing seamstress work, private commissions." "That's right." Mrs. Brennan's fingers twisted in the fabric of her shawl. "I have a dress. It needs altering. My daughter's getting married in the spring, and I thought—" She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "Would you be willing to take the work?" Mara studied the woman who had gossiped about her so cruelly just weeks ago. She could refuse, could take petty satisfaction in turning away business. But Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. "Build your reputation, build your connections, build your life." "Of course," Mara said graciously. "Bring the dress to the parsonage next Sunday after services. We'll discuss what needs to be done." Mrs. Brennan's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Miss Ellington, and I apologize for what I said before about you and Mr. Hale. It was unkind." "It was." Mara met her eyes steadily. "But I appreciate the apology. I'll see you Sunday." She left the store with her head high, aware of the watching eyes, the whispered conversations. Let them watch. Let them whisper. She was building something here, brick by brick, stitch by stitch. And she wasn't going to let their small-mindedness stop her. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Mara worked at the Peterson Ranch during the week, her skills and efficiency earning her increasing respect from Mrs. Peterson. On Sundays, she attended church, met with clients at the parsonage, and then, after everyone else had gone home, she drove the wagon out to Jonas's cabin. They never planned these visits explicitly, but every Sunday Jonas would be there, waiting, with coffee already made and the fire burning warm. They would sit at his small table and talk for hours, about the town, about the railroad, about books and memories and dreams deferred. Sometimes they argued. Jonas had strong opinions about territorial politics, and Mara wasn't afraid to challenge them. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, Jonas carving while Mara mended whatever work she'd brought with her. Slowly, carefully, they built something between them. Not romance, not yet, but something deeper than simple friendship. A recognition, a kinship, a sense of two broken pieces finding ways to fit together. The town noticed, of course. The gossip intensified. But Mara discovered something surprising. The more visible her visits became, the more people seemed to accept them. Jonas Hale might be a recluse, but he was a respected one. And Mara's growing reputation as a skilled seamstress lent her own form of respectability. Together, they became an oddity that Brimstone Ridge learned to accommodate. It was on a Sunday in early December, 8 weeks after Mara's first visit back to Jonas's cabin, that everything changed. Mara arrived at the usual time to find Jonas standing outside his cabin, his expression dark. 3 men on horseback were with him, and even from a distance, Mara could see the tension in Jonas's shoulders. She climbed down from the wagon and approached cautiously. The men on horseback turned to look at her, and one of them, a well-dressed man with slicked back hair and expensive boots, smiled in a way that made Mara's skin crawl. "Well, well," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "You must be the famous seamstress everyone's talking about. Mara Ellington, isn't it?" Mara froze. She knew that voice, had heard it in her nightmares for 6 months. "Hello, Darren," she said quietly. Jonas's head snapped toward her. "You know this man?" Darren Cole dismounted from his horse with practiced ease, his smile widening. He was handsome in a calculated way, perfectly groomed, perfectly dressed, every inch the successful businessman. Mara had once thought that polish was attractive. Now she saw it for what it was, a carefully constructed facade hiding something rotten underneath. "Know her? We're practically engaged." Darren's eyes gleamed with possessive satisfaction. "Isn't that right, my dear?" "No," Mara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We were never engaged. I refused your proposal. That's why I left Philadelphia." "A misunderstanding." Darren waved his hand dismissively. "You were overwhelmed, understandably. But I'm a patient man. I knew you'd come to your senses eventually." Jonas stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Mara and Darren. "The lady said no. Time you respected that and moved on." Darren's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "And you are?" "Someone telling you to leave." "I don't think so." Darren pulled a folded paper from his coat. "You see, I'm here on business. Railroad business. I'm the Chief Land Acquisitions Officer for the Western Expansion Project, and your property, Mr. Hale, is one we're interested in purchasing." Jonas's jaw tightened. "Not for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price. We're prepared to offer you $500. That's more than fair for this amount of acreage." "I said not for sale." Darren's expression hardened. "Then perhaps we should discuss eminent domain. The railroad has government backing, Mr. Hale. We can take this land with or without your cooperation. The only question is whether you walk away with money in your pocket or with nothing at all." "You can't do that," Mara said, anger flaring in her chest. "He has legal title. You can't just—" "Oh, Mara," Darren turned to her with mock sympathy. "Still so naive. Of course we can. The law is written by men with money and power, and I have both." He took a step closer. "But perhaps we can come to an arrangement. I'm willing to overlook your little adventure out here. The seamstress work, the association with Mr. Hale. We can go back to Philadelphia, get married properly, and forget any of this ever happened. All I ask is that you convince your friend here to take the railroad's generous offer." Mara stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time what she'd escaped. Darren Cole wasn't a man who loved her. He was a man who wanted to own her, to control her, to use her as a pretty ornament in his carefully constructed life. And now that she'd escaped, he'd followed her across half the country to drag her back. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Mara said, her voice like ice. "And Jonas's land is his own business. You have no power over either of us." Darren's facade cracked, just slightly. "You think you have choices here? You think this backwater town will protect you? I can destroy both of you. Your reputation is already damaged, Mara. One word from me, a few strategic rumors, and no one will hire you. You'll be ruined." Better ruined than owned by you. Darren's face flushed with anger. You ungrateful! Jonas's hand shot out and gripped Darren's shoulder, hard enough to make the other man wince. Time for you to leave. Now! Darren wrenched himself free, his composure shattered. You're making a mistake, both of you. The railroad's coming through whether you cooperate or not. And Mara, he fixed her with a look of pure venom. You're going to regret choosing this nobody over me. He remounted his horse with jerky movements, his two companions following suit. They rode away in a cloud of dust and fury, leaving Mara and Jonas standing in the cold December air. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. That's who you ran from, Jonas said finally. It wasn't a question. Yes. He's dangerous. I know. Mara's hands were shaking. She clasped them together to still them. He's powerful, wealthy, connected, and he doesn't accept losing. I thought putting 1,000 miles between us would be enough. But he followed me anyway. Jonas turned to face her fully, his gray-blue eyes intense. He threatened you. He's been threatening me for months. That's why I left. He wanted to marry me, but not as a partner, as a possession, something beautiful to display, to control. When I refused, he made my life impossible in Philadelphia, ruined my reputation, made sure I couldn't get work, told everyone I was unstable, hysterical. Mara's voice cracked. So I ran. I thought out here in the middle of nowhere I could finally be free of him. You are free of him. Am I? You heard what he said? He can destroy my business, ruin what little reputation I've built. And he's with the railroad now, which means he has government power behind him. Jonas's expression was hard as granite. Let him try. He'll find this town isn't Philadelphia. Jonas, he's not bluffing about the railroad. He can take your land. Maybe, but he'll have to fight for it. And I've been through worse fights than this. Jonas reached out and took Mara's trembling hands in his own, his calloused fingers warm and steady. Mara, listen to me. You're not alone in this. Whatever Cole tries to do, we'll face it together. Understand? Mara looked up at him, this quiet, wounded man who had offered her shelter in a storm and was now offering her something even more precious. Solidarity, alliance, partnership. Together, she whispered. Together, Jonas confirmed. Now come inside. We need to make plans. They sat at Jonas's table, the coffee growing cold between them as they strategized like generals preparing for war. Jonas had pulled out his land deed, spreading the yellowed paper flat, his finger tracing the property boundaries while Mara watched with growing concern. The deed's solid, Jonas said. Purchased legally 8 years ago, taxes paid in full every year. But if Cole's telling the truth about government backing, legal title might not matter. Then what do we do? Jonas leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant with thought. We make it costly. If Cole wants this land, he'll have to fight for every inch. Public fights attract attention. Attention makes politicians nervous, and nervous politicians pull funding. You want to make a spectacle of it? I want to make it more trouble than it's worth. Jonas met her eyes. But that means putting yourself in the line of fire, too. Cole will escalate. He'll use every dirty trick he knows to force you back under his control. Mara felt something cold and determined settle in her chest. Let him try. I'm not the frightened girl who ran from Philadelphia anymore. No, Jonas said quietly, something like admiration warming his voice. No, you're not. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. Jonas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. Rider coming fast. Mara joined him at the window and recognized Mr. Peterson's ranch foreman, his horse lathered with sweat. Jonas opened the door before the man could dismount. Mr. Hale. Miss Ellington. The foreman was breathing hard. Mrs. Peterson sent me. There's trouble in town. That railroad man, Cole, he's at the saloon buying drinks and spreading lies. Says Miss Ellington's a fallen woman who ran from her debts and dishonored her family. Says she's been living in sin with you, Mr. Hale, playing the innocent while corrupting good Christian men. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. He's destroying my reputation. He's trying, the foreman said grimly. But Mrs. Peterson says to tell you she's not having it. She's calling an emergency town meeting at the church. Says if Cole wants to slander her employees, he can do it to her face. Jonas was already pulling on his coat. When? 1 hour. Mrs. Peterson says you should both be there. They rode into town together, Mara in the wagon and Jonas on his horse, a tall shadow beside her. The streets were already filling with people, drawn by the promise of drama like moths to flame. Mara could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers that followed her passage. Some faces were sympathetic. Others were eager, hungry for scandal. The church was packed when they arrived. Mrs. Peterson stood at the front like a general surveying troops, her silver hair immaculate, her expression carved from ice. Mr. Peterson stood beside her, his weathered face set in hard lines. Eleanor Thomas was at the piano, and Reverend Thomas sat in the front pew despite his obvious frailty, his rheumy eyes sharp with interest. Darren Cole stood near the pulpit, impeccably dressed and wearing an expression of wounded righteousness. His two associates flanked him like hired muscle. When Mara and Jonas entered, Darren's eyes lit with predatory satisfaction. "Ah, the lady herself," Darren called out, his voice carrying through the church. "And her paramour. How convenient." Jonas's hand found Mara's elbow, steadying. They walked together down the center aisle, and Mara kept her head high, refusing to be cowed by the watching crowd. Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. "Mr. Cole has made certain allegations regarding Miss Ellington's character. I've called this meeting so he can present his evidence publicly, rather than spreading poison through whispers and bought drinks. Mr. Cole, you have the floor." Darren stepped forward, his smile never wavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, I come before you with a heavy heart. Miss Ellington and I were engaged to be married in Philadelphia. Her father had given his blessing before he died, but Mara, troubled by grief, I believe, broke our engagement and fled in the night, leaving behind considerable debts and a family in disgrace." "That's a lie," Mara said, her voice ringing clear in the silent church. "Is it? Then why did you run? Why did you travel 1,000 miles to this isolated town?" Darren's expression was one of pained concern, perfectly calibrated to win sympathy. "I've spent 6 months searching for you, Mara. I came here to bring you home, to restore your honor and settle your debts. Instead, I find you've been living in inappropriate circumstances with a known recluse." "Inappropriate circumstances?" Eleanor Thomas stood up from the piano bench, her small frame vibrating with indignation. "Miss Ellington stayed in Mr. Hale's cabin during a blizzard because every other door in this town was closed to her. She would have frozen to death if not for his kindness. There's nothing inappropriate about survival. One night, perhaps," Darren conceded smoothly. "But I'm told she visits his cabin regularly, alone, for hours at a time. What are we to think of such behavior?" "We're to think she's visiting a friend," Mrs. Peterson said coldly. "Unless you're suggesting that friendship between men and women is inherently sinful, Mr. Cole. I'm suggesting that a woman of quality maintains certain standards, and Miss Ellington's behavior raises questions about her judgment, her morals, and her fitness to work in respectable households." Mara felt rage building in her chest, hot and righteous. She stepped forward, Jonas's hand falling away from her elbow, and faced Darren across the church. "You want to talk about morals? Let's talk about yours, Darren. You proposed marriage, but what you really wanted was ownership. When I said no, you systematically destroyed my ability to earn a living in Philadelphia. You spread lies about my mental state. You had your friends refuse me work. You made it impossible for me to survive in that city unless I accepted your proposal. I tried to help you. You tried to control me. There's a difference." Mara's voice grew stronger with each word. "I came west to escape your control, to build a life on my own terms. And yes, when I arrived here during a blizzard, Jonas Hale gave me shelter. He gave me blankets and food and asked nothing in return. He treated me with more respect in 2 days than you showed me in 2 years." Darren's mask slipped, just slightly. "You're clearly still distraught. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying no. I said it in Philadelphia, and I'm saying it now. No to your proposal, no to your control, no to your poison dressed up as concern." The church had gone completely silent. Every eye was fixed on Mara, and she felt the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their calculation. This was the moment that would define her future in Brimstone Ridge. Either they would believe her, or Darren would win. It was Mrs. Peterson who broke the silence. Miss Ellington has worked in my household for 2 months. In that time, she has proven herself to be skilled, professional, and completely trustworthy. Her character is beyond reproach. If Mr. Cole has actual evidence of debts or impropriety, let him present it. Otherwise, I suggest he take his slander and his railroad business and leave this town. The railroad business stays, Darren said, his voice hardening. We have government contracts to fulfill, but perhaps we should discuss those contracts. Mr. Hale's land, for instance. I've made him a fair offer. He's refused. That seems unwise, given that his reputation is now linked to Miss Ellington's. If she's shown to be a woman of questionable character, what does that say about a man who harbors her? It was a threat, barely veiled. Taint Mara's reputation, and Jonas would suffer by association. Jonas would lose community support, making it easier to seize his land. Jonas stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the church. You want to talk about character? Let's talk about yours, Cole. You followed a woman across half a country because you can't accept that she doesn't want you. You're using your railroad position to threaten people into compliance. You're trying to destroy a woman's livelihood because she wounded your pride. Jonas paused, his gray-blue eyes cold as winter. That's not a man of character. That's a coward with power. Darren's face flushed dark red. You know nothing about me. I know enough. I know you're the kind of man who buys drinks to spread lies. The kind who threatens women to get what he wants. The kind who hides behind government contracts and makes himself feel big by making others feel small. Jonas moved to stand beside Mara, not touching her but close enough that the message was clear. Solidarity, partnership, protection. Miss Ellington doesn't want you. This town doesn't want your poison, and my land's not for sale at any price, so you've got a choice. You can leave with dignity, or you can leave another way. But you're leaving. The church erupted in murmurs. Darren looked around at the watching faces and seemed to realize he was losing control of the narrative. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling, revealing the bitter, vindictive man underneath. You'll regret this, Darren said, his voice shaking with rage. All of you. The railroad's coming through whether you like it or not, and I'll make sure Jonas Hale gets nothing for his land. I'll see him ruined. And Mara, he fixed her with a look of pure hatred. I'll make sure you never work again. Not here, not anywhere. Get out of my church, Reverend Thomas croaked from his pew, his voice stronger than his frail body suggested possible. You've brought evil here, Mr. Cole. We don't tolerate that in God's house. Darren stared at the old pastor, at the crowd of hostile faces, and seemed to realize he'd miscalculated badly. He'd expected a frontier town to be easily swayed, easily corrupted. Instead, he'd united them against him. This isn't over, he said, but the words lacked conviction. He stalked out of the church, his associates scrambling to follow. The door slammed behind them with a finality that echoed through the space. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Peterson spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. I believe we've wasted enough time on Mr. Cole's theatrics. Miss Ellington, Mr. Hale, you have my complete support. Anyone who wishes to continue doing business with the Peterson Ranch will treat them both with respect. Are we clear? There was a murmur of assent from the crowd. Not everyone looked happy about it. Mara could see disapproval on some faces, calculation on others, but Mrs. Peterson's position as the wealthiest landowner in the area carried weight. Eleanor Thomas hurried over, her eyes bright with tears. My dear girl, you were magnificent. I was angry, Mara said, her hands beginning to shake now that the confrontation was over. You were brave. Eleanor squeezed her arm. And Mr. Hale, I don't think I've heard you string that many words together in 8 years. Jonas looked uncomfortable with the attention. Seemed like the time for talking. Other townspeople approached, some offering support, others clearly fishing for more details about the scandal. Mara answered as graciously as she could, but exhaustion was setting in. She felt Jonas's hand touch her elbow again, gentle but insistent. We should go, he murmured. Mrs. Peterson intercepted them at the door. Miss Ellington, take tomorrow off. You've earned it. And Mr. Hale, she fixed him with a penetrating stare. Thank you for speaking up. That took courage. Just told the truth. Yes, well, truth is often the most dangerous thing to speak. Mrs. Peterson glanced toward the door where Darren had exited. He meant those threats, you know. He'll come after both of you. Let him, Mara said, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. I'm not running anymore. Mrs. Peterson smiled, and there was something fierce in it. Good, because we need more women in this territory who don't run. Now go rest. Both of you. We'll deal with tomorrow when it comes. They walked out into the cold December afternoon together. The sun was already sinking toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Mara's wagon waited where she'd left it, but she found herself reluctant to climb aboard, reluctant to leave Jonas's steadying presence. Thank you, she said quietly, for what you said in there, for standing with me. Jonas looked down at her, his weathered face catching the golden light. I meant every word. You're not alone in this, Mara. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Together, she repeated, and the word felt like a promise. They stood there in the street as the sun set, two people who'd been broken by loss and betrayal, who'd found in each other something neither had expected, an ally, a friend, maybe something more. Come back to the cabin, Jonas said suddenly. It's getting dark. You shouldn't drive alone. Jonas, that'll just fuel more gossip. Don't care about gossip. Care about you being safe. His jaw tightened. Cole's dangerous, Mara. Cornered men do desperate things. Please. Just tonight. Tomorrow I'll ride with you to the ranch. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to prove she could handle herself. But the truth was she was tired, shaken, and the thought of Jonas's cabin, warm and safe and smelling of wood smoke, was more appealing than the long ride to the Peterson ranch in gathering darkness. All right, she said. Just tonight. They rode together through the twilight, Jonas on his horse and Mara in her wagon. The town was quiet now, most people inside for supper, but Mara saw curtains twitch as they passed, saw faces at windows. The gossip would start again before morning. She found she didn't care. Jonas's cabin welcomed them with familiar warmth. He built up the fire while Mara put water on for coffee, moving through the small space with the ease of repetition. They'd done this dance so many times now, the small rituals of hospitality and comfort, that it felt almost like home. You should eat, Jonas said, pulling out bread and cheese and dried venison. You barely touched anything at lunch. How do you know that? I know. He set the food on the table. You get a certain look when you're hungry, but too stubborn to admit it. Despite everything, Mara smiled. What look? Like you're about to argue with the world and need fuel for the fight. That's surprisingly accurate. They ate together in comfortable silence, the kind that came from understanding rather than awkwardness. Outside, night fell completely, bringing with it a cold that seeped through the walls. Jonas added more wood to the fire, and Mara found herself watching the way the light played across his features, the way his hands moved with such careful precision. What are you thinking? Jonas asked without looking at her. That I'm glad you were there today, that I couldn't have faced Darren alone. You could have. You were handling him fine before I said anything. Maybe, but it felt better not having to. Mara set down her cup. Jonas, what if he makes good on his threats? What if he ruins my business, takes your land? Then we find another way. Build another business, claim another piece of land. Jonas turned to face her fully. Mara, I spent 8 years hiding in this cabin because I was afraid that caring about anything would destroy it. But you know what I learned today? What? That hiding doesn't protect you. It just makes you smaller and smaller until there's nothing left to protect. He took a breath. You made me remember what it's like to fight for something, to care about something enough to risk losing it. I'm not going back to hiding. Mara felt tears prick her eyes. I'm scared. So am I. But maybe being scared together is better than being safe alone. She crossed the small distance between them, and Jonas stood to meet her. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, and Mara saw in his gray-blue eyes everything he couldn't say, fear and hope, and something that might have been the beginning of love. Stay, Jonas said softly. Not just tonight. Stay as long as you need. This cabin, this land, it's safer with 2 people defending it than 1. Jonas, people will talk. They'll assume, let them assume. I don't care anymore what people think. I care about keeping you safe. Mara's heart hammered in her chest. What are you saying? Jonas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused, steady. I'm saying I can't promise you romance or pretty words or any of the things a proper suitor would offer. But I can promise you safety, partnership, a home where you're valued for who you are, not what someone thinks you should be. That's not nothing, Jonas. That's everything. His fingers tightened on hers. Then say yes. Stay with me. Let me help you fight coal and the railroad and whatever else comes. Let me be the thing standing between you and the people who want to hurt you. And what do you get out of this arrangement? Jonas smiled, rare and genuine. You. Your arguments and your stubborn pride and the way you make this cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home. That's more than I've had in 8 years. Mara knew she should be practical, should think about reputation and propriety and all the ways this could go wrong. But standing there in the firelight, her hand in Jonas's, she found she didn't care about any of that. Yes, she whispered. I'll stay. Something shifted in Jonas's expression, a wall coming down, a door opening. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, gentle, reverent, full of promise. Then welcome home, Mara Ellington. They stood together in the warm cabin while outside the winter wind howled, and somewhere in town Darren Cole plotted his revenge. But for this one perfect moment, Mara felt safe, protected, seen. The days that followed were a test of their resolve. Darren didn't leave Brimstone Ridge as they'd hoped. Instead, he took rooms above the saloon and began a calculated campaign of destruction. He spread rumors through every channel he could access, that Mara had debts in Philadelphia, that Jonas was an unstable veteran who'd never recovered from the war, that their living arrangement was proof of moral corruption. He bought drinks for influential men, made promises to struggling ranchers about railroad jobs, used every tool of manipulation he possessed, but he'd underestimated the frontier's stubborn independence. The very people he tried to sway often bristled at his entitled confidence, his assumption that money and Eastern manners would win them over. And Mrs. Peterson proved to be a formidable ally. She made it clear that anyone who shunned Mara or Jonas would find themselves on the wrong side of the Peterson ranch, which meant losing access to the best grazing land and the most reliable cattle sales in the territory. Still, the pressure built. Mara lost some clients, women whose husbands were courting railroad contracts, families who couldn't afford to be associated with scandal. Her income dropped. Jonas found his supply orders delayed, his credit questioned at stores where he'd traded for years. Small cruelties designed to isolate and weaken. Through it all, they maintained their routine. Mara worked at the Peterson Ranch during the week, took what commissions she could get on weekends, and spent her evenings at Jonas's cabin. They didn't live together openly. Mara kept a room at the ranch for appearance's sake, but everyone knew where she really belonged. 2 weeks after the church confrontation, on a gray December morning that promised snow, Mara was working in her sewing room at the ranch when Mrs. Peterson entered without knocking. "There's news from town," Mrs. Peterson said, her face grave. "The railroad's announced its final route. Jonas's land is on it. They're prepared to offer $700, final offer, or proceed with eminent domain proceedings." Mara's hand stilled on the fabric. "When?" "They want an answer by the end of the week." $700 was better than the original offer, but it was still robbery for land Jonas had built with his own hands, and it came with an ultimatum: sell or be destroyed. "I need to tell him." "Go. I'll manage here." Mrs. Peterson paused at the door. "Mara, whatever you and Jonas decide, you have my support. But be careful. Cole's pushed into a corner now. The railroads put pressure on him to close this deal. Desperate men make dangerous choices." Mara rode to Jonas's cabin with Mrs. Peterson's warning echoing in her mind. She found him outside chopping wood, his breath fogging in the cold air, his axe rising and falling with methodical precision. He stopped when he saw her, reading trouble in her face. "What happened?" She told him about the railroad's announcement, the final offer, the deadline. Jonas listened without interruption, his expression growing harder with each word. "They think they can force me off my own land," he said finally, his voice flat with contained rage. "Can they?" "Legally? Maybe. The government's given railroads broad powers to claim land for public use. But it takes time, surveys, hearings, legal proceedings. They'd rather I just take the money and leave quietly. What do you want to do? Jonas drove the axe into the chopping block and turned to face her fully. I want to fight. But fighting means lawyers, which means money we don't have. It means hearings in the territorial capital, which means time away from work. It means making ourselves even more visible, more vulnerable. So we're trapped. Maybe. Jonas ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. Unless we give them a reason to back off. What kind of reason? The kind that makes them look bad. Railroad companies care about their reputation. They need community support to operate efficiently. If we could make this into a public relations disaster, show that they're bullying honest landowners, stealing from the very people they claim to be helping, Jonas trailed off, thinking. We'd need witnesses, documentation, someone with credibility to testify to what Cole's really doing. Mara's mind raced, pieces clicking together. Mrs. Peterson. She was at the territorial meeting. She heard them talking about their tactics, their willingness to use eminent domain as a threat, and she's got influence. Her family's been in this territory for 30 years. Would she testify? I think she might. She's already stood up for us once. Mara grabbed Jonas's arm, excitement building. Jonas, what if we don't fight this quietly? What if we make noise? Write to newspapers, contact territorial representatives, make sure everyone knows what the railroad's doing? Jonas looked at her with something like wonder. That could work. Public pressure might force them to negotiate fairly. Or it could make them come down harder. That's the risk. Jonas covered her hand with his grip warm and steady. Mara, if we do this, there's no going back. Cole will escalate. He'll use everything he can against us. It could get ugly. It's already ugly. At least this way we're fighting back. She met his eyes, finding her own courage reflected there. Together, right? Together, Jonas confirmed. Always. They spent the afternoon planning their campaign. Jonas would ride to the territorial capital to file formal objections to the eminent domain proceedings. Mara would contact newspapers, write letters detailing the railroad's bullying tactics. Mrs. Peterson would use her connections to pressure territorial representatives. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was action, and action felt better than helpless waiting. That evening, as Mara prepared to return to the ranch, Jonas stopped her at the door. Mara, there's something I need to say. She turned, surprised by the intensity in his voice. When you first showed up at my door during that storm, I was just existing, going through motions, waiting for time to pass. I'd convinced myself that was enough, that survival was the same as living. Jonas took a breath. You changed that. You made me remember that life's worth fighting for, that caring about someone isn't a weakness, it's a strength. Mara felt her throat tighten with emotion. Jonas? Let me finish. I don't know what happens next. Maybe we win this fight. Maybe we lose. Maybe the railroad takes everything, or maybe we find a way through. But whatever happens, I need you to know that these last few months, knowing you, fighting beside you, that's been worth more than all the years I spent hiding. Mara crossed the space between them and took his weathered face in her hands. I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me, Jonas Hale. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and they stood together in the doorway as snow began to fall. Two broken people who'd found in each other the strength to stand whole. Two fighters preparing for the battle of their lives. Whatever Darren Cole threw at them next, they would face it together. And that, Mara thought, as Jonas's heartbeat thrummed steady beneath her ear, was worth any fight. The snow fell heavier that night, thick flakes that muffled sound and turned the world into something hushed and sacred. Mara rode back to the Peterson ranch with Jonas's words warming her more than any coat could, feeling for the first time in her life like she'd found exactly where she belonged. But the peace didn't last. 3 days later, Darren made his move. He arrived at the Peterson ranch in a hired carriage, accompanied by a territorial marshal and 2 lawyers with expensive suits and hard eyes. Mrs. Peterson met them on the porch, her spine straight as iron, and refused to let them inside. Miss Ellington doesn't wish to see you, Mr. Cole. I'm afraid what Miss Ellington wishes is irrelevant. Darren produced a sheaf of papers from his coat. I've obtained a warrant for her arrest. Unpaid debts in Philadelphia, failure to honor a legally binding contract, theft of family property. The marshal here will be escorting her back east to face charges. Mara, watching from an upstairs window, felt the blood drain from her face. She'd known Darren was dangerous, but she'd underestimated how far he'd go. The debts were fabricated, the contract non-existent, but proving that would require lawyers, time, and money she didn't have. Mrs. Peterson's voice carried up to the window, cold with fury. Those are serious allegations, Mr. Cole. I trust you have evidence? Affidavits from creditors, signed contracts, witness testimonies, all legally obtained and verified. Darren's smile was triumphant. Miss Ellington can contest the charges, of course, but she'll have to do so from a Philadelphia jail cell while awaiting trial. The trap was perfect. Either Mara went with the marshal and spent months fighting false charges in a city where Darren controlled the courts, or she resisted arrest and became a fugitive, destroying any credibility they'd built in their fight against the railroad. Mara was halfway down the stairs, prepared to surrender rather than bring more trouble on the Petersons, when Jonas burst through the front door. He must have ridden hard. His horse was lathered with sweat, his coat dusted with snow, but his eyes were clear and cold, and he carried a leather satchel that he thrust at the marshal. Before you take anyone anywhere, you might want to read these. The marshal, an older man with a weathered face that suggested he'd seen his share of corruption, opened the satchel with curiosity. Inside were documents, dozens of them, each one stamped and notarized. That's proof that Mara Ellington has no outstanding debts in Philadelphia, Jonas said, his voice carrying across the porch. Bank statements showing all accounts settled before her departure. Statements from creditors confirming full payment. And this, he pulled out another document, is a letter from Mara's stepmother acknowledging that no contract for marriage ever existed, signed before witnesses 3 days ago. Darren's face went white, then red. That's impossible. How did you? I sent telegrams the day after you showed up. To banks, to lawyers, to Mara's stepmother. Turns out when you offer someone money to tell the truth, they're often willing. Jonas's smile was grim. Cost me most of my savings, but it was worth it. The marshal was reading through the documents with increasing interest. These look legitimate, Mr. Cole. Very legitimate. In fact, they suggest your warrant was obtained under false pretenses. There must be some mistake. No mistake. The marshal's voice had gone hard. I don't appreciate being used to settle personal vendettas, Mr. Cole. Wastes the territory's time and makes me look like a fool. He turned to Mara, who had emerged onto the porch beside Mrs. Peterson. Miss Ellington, you're free to go. I apologize for the inconvenience. Darren's lawyers were already backing toward the carriage, clearly wanting no part of what was about to unfold. Darren stood alone on the porch, his carefully constructed scheme crumbling around him. You've made a serious error, the marshal continued, fixing Darren with a look that promised consequences. Filing false charges is a crime. I could arrest you right now. I was given bad information, Darren said quickly. A misunderstanding. Surely we can get out of this territory, Mr. Cole, and take your railroad business with you. I'll be filing a report about this incident, and I can promise you the territorial governor won't be pleased. The marshal tipped his hat to Mrs. Peterson and Mara. Ladies, Mr. Hale, good day. He left, and Darren was forced to follow, his face twisted with impotent rage. But as he climbed into his carriage, he fixed Jonas with a look of pure hatred. This isn't over. The railroad still wants your land, Hale, and I'll make sure they take it, along with everything else you care about. The carriage rolled away, leaving silence in its wake. Mara found she was shaking. Jonas's arm came around her shoulders, steady and warm, and she leaned into him without caring who saw. How did you do that? She whispered. How did you get those documents so quickly? Paid extra for emergency telegrams, called in favors, spent money I probably shouldn't have. Jonas looked down at her, his gray-blue eyes soft. But you were worth every penny. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat delicately. Mr. Hale, that was remarkably resourceful. However, Mr. Cole is correct about one thing. The railroad still wants your land. This personal vendetta may be over, but the business matter remains. I know. Jonas's expression hardened. which is why Mara and I are getting married. The words hung in the cold December air like crystallized breath. Mara's head snapped up and misses. Peterson's eyebrows rose to her hairline. Married? Mara managed. Married, Jonas confirmed, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Tomorrow, if you'll have me. Reverend Thomas can perform the ceremony. It's not romantic and it's not what you deserve, but it's strategic. As my wife, you'll have legal claim to my property. If the railroad tries to take it, they'll have to deal with both of us. 2 claims, 2 legal battles. Harder to win, more expensive, more public. Jonas, you can't marry me just to protect your land. I'm not. He turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face. I'm marrying you because I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Because these past months have shown me what partnership looks like, what home feels like. The railroad's just a convenient excuse to do what I should have asked weeks ago. Mara stared at him, her heart hammering. That's the worst marriage proposal I've ever heard. It's the only one you'll get from me. Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the absurdity of the moment, Mara laughed. Then yes, I'll marry you, Jonas Hale. Mrs. Peterson's stern expression cracked into something that might have been a smile. Well, this is unexpected, though perhaps not entirely surprising. She turned toward the house. I'll send word to Reverend Thomas, and Miss Ellington, you'll need a proper dress. Come inside. We have work to do. The next day dawned clear and cold. The sky that particular shade of blue that only winter could produce. The church filled early, drawn by news that had spread through Brimstone Ridge like wildfire. Some came out of genuine affection for Mara and Jonas. Others came for the spectacle, eager to witness what the gossips were already calling the scandal wedding. Mara stood in the church's small back room, smoothing down the blue wool dress she'd worn to the territorial meeting dinner. It wasn't a traditional wedding dress, but Mrs. Peterson had worked miracles with it overnight, adding lace to the collar, letting out the hem, transforming it into something that felt appropriate for the occasion. Eleanor Thomas fussed with Mara's hair, pinning it up in a style that was elegant without being too elaborate. You're shaking, dear. I'm terrified. Of marrying Jonas? Of what comes after. Darren won't give up. The railroad won't give up. We're painting targets on our backs. Eleanor's hand stilled in Mara's hair. My dear, you've had a target on your back since you refused to be what others wanted you to be. At least now you'll face it with someone who stands beside you, rather than behind you, demanding you shrink. A knock came at the door, and Mrs. Peterson entered carrying a small bouquet of winter berries and evergreen. The Reverend is ready, the church is full, and Mr. Hale looks like he's about to faint, which I find oddly charming. She handed Mara the bouquet. Are you ready? Mara took a breath, squared her shoulders, and thought about Jonas waiting for her at the altar. Jonas who had given her shelter in a storm. Jonas who had defended her in front of the entire town. Jonas who had spent his savings to prove her innocence. Jonas who made her feel seen, valued, strong. I'm ready. The church doors opened and Mara walked down the aisle alone. She didn't have a father to give her away, didn't need one. She was giving herself to this marriage, to this man, of her own free will and full heart. Jonas stood at the altar in his best clothes, still simple, still practical, but clean and pressed. His gray-blue eyes found hers across the space, and something in his expression softened. Not quite a smile, but close. An acknowledgement, a recognition, a promise. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony in his wavering voice, Eleanor playing soft hymns on the piano. The words were traditional, the vows ancient, but when Jonas slipped a simple gold band onto Mara's finger and said, I do, it felt revolutionary. When Mara took Jonas's calloused hand in hers and promised to honor him, it felt like claiming her own freedom. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thomas said, and then added with a wheezing chuckle, Mr. Hale, you may kiss your bride. Jonas leaned down, his hand gentle on Mara's cheek, and kissed her softly. It was brief, almost chaste, but it held within it everything words couldn't express. Gratitude, protection, partnership, and the tentative beginning of something that might one day become love. The church erupted in applause. Not everyone was happy. Mara saw disapproving faces in the crowd, heard the whispers about impropriety and unseemly haste, but she also saw Eleanor Thomas crying happy tears, Mrs. Peterson nodding with satisfaction, and the ranchers who'd stood up at the territorial meeting offering gruff congratulations. They walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, and Mara felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for as long as she could remember. This was home. Not a place, not a building, but this man beside her with his quiet strength and his wounded heart that had somehow found room for her. The celebration that followed was modest but warm. The townspeople who supported them brought food, and an impromptu reception formed in the church hall. Jonas stood awkwardly in the center of attention, clearly uncomfortable with the fuss, while Mara moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and trying not to think about the fact that they'd just taken an irrevocable step into an uncertain future. It was near sunset when the trouble arrived. Darren Cole appeared in the church hall doorway like a vengeful ghost, flanked by 4 rough-looking men Mara didn't recognize. The celebration died instantly, conversations trailing off into tense silence. "How touching," Darren said, his voice dripping venom. "A wedding. I wasn't invited." Jonas moved to stand between Darren and Mara, his body language shifting into something harder, more dangerous. "You're not welcome here, Cole. Leave." "Oh, I will. But first I wanted to deliver some news. The Railroads Board has reviewed your case, Mr. Hale. They've decided to proceed with eminent domain. Your land will be seized in 30 days. You can either accept compensation or be forcibly removed. Either way, you're leaving." "We'll fight it," Mara said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "With what? Legal fees require money. Money requires work. And who's going to hire either of you now?" Darren's smile was cruel. "I've already made sure every ranch within 50 miles knows about your situation. The scandal, the debt allegations, the impropriety. Even if those charges were dropped, the reputation damage remains. You're poison, both of you." Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her face carved from ice. "Mr. Cole, I've tolerated your presence in this territory out of professional courtesy. But my patience has limits. Threaten my employees again, and you'll find that the Peterson Ranch has significant influence with the territorial government, influence that could make your railroad's permits very difficult to maintain." Darren's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me, Mrs. Peterson?" "I'm explaining consequences. Something you seem to have difficulty understanding." She turned to address the gathered townspeople. "The railroad has declared its intentions. They will take land through government force, displacing families who've built homes here, who've invested their lives here. Mr. Hale's property is first, but others will follow. The question is whether we stand together against this abuse of power, or whether we let them divide us through fear and intimidation." A rancher named Bill Hutchins spoke up from the back of the hall. "The railroad's offering jobs, good wages. My son could use that work." "Jobs that last how long?" Jonas's voice cut through the murmur. 6 months, a year, just long enough to build the line. Then the railroad moves on and you're left with nothing but torn up land and broken promises." "You're biased," someone else called out. "It's your land they want. Today it's my land. Tomorrow it might be yours." Jonas's gaze swept the room. "How many of you remember when the railroad promised fair compensation to the Hendersons? They offered $200 for prime grazing land worth 10 times that. When the Hendersons refused, the railroad found legal loopholes, tied them up in courts they couldn't afford, and eventually took the land for nothing. The Hendersons lost everything." The room had gone quiet, people exchanging glances. The Henderson story was well known, a cautionary tale that had made many ranchers wary of railroad dealings. "That's different," Darren began. "How is it different?" Mara interrupted, her voice ringing clear. "The tactics are the same, the results are the same. The railroad wants land, and they'll use whatever means necessary to get it. Today they're offering money. Tomorrow they'll use force, and you'll all stand by and watch because it's not your problem. Until suddenly it is." Mr. Peterson, who had been silent until now, moved to stand beside his wife. "My family has ranched this territory for 30 years. We've seen companies come and go, seen promises made and broken. The railroad's not our enemy. Progress isn't our enemy. But corruption is. Abuse of power is. And I'll be damned if I stand by and watch good people lose their homes because a company decided they're inconvenient. The mood in the room was shifting. Mara could feel it, could see it in the way people straightened their spines, in the way their expressions hardened from uncertainty to resolve. Darren sensed it too. His face flushed dark red, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. You're all fools. The railroad will come through whether you fight or not. All you're doing is making it harder on yourselves. Then we'll make it hard, Jonas said quietly. Because some things are worth fighting for. Land, home, dignity. The right to build a life without someone with money and power taking it away on a whim. Poetic, Darren sneered. But poetry doesn't win legal battles, and it certainly doesn't stop progress. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Enjoy your wedding night, Mr. and Mrs. Hale. It might be the last peaceful night you have for a very long time. He left, his hired men following, and silence fell over the church hall. Then Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. I'll contact my lawyer, see about organizing a legal defense fund for landowners threatened by eminent domain proceedings. I'll write to the territorial newspapers, another rancher offered. Make sure people know what's happening here. My cousin works for the territorial legislature, someone else said. I can get him information about the railroad's tactics. One by one, the people of Brimstone Ridge stepped forward with offers of help, of solidarity, of resistance. What had started as Mara and Jonas's fight became something larger, something communal, a stand against the kind of casual cruelty that assumed ordinary people were too small, too powerless to matter. Mrs. Peterson surveyed the gathering with satisfaction. It seems you've started something, Mr. and Mrs. Hale. I hope you're prepared for the consequences. Jonas's arm found Mara's waist, pulling her close. We're prepared. The celebration reformed, but with a different energy now. Not just a wedding party, but a war council. Plans were made, strategies discussed, contacts shared. Mara watched it all with a mixture of hope and fear. They'd united the town, which was good, but they'd also made themselves the focal point of a much larger fight. What have we done? She murmured to Jonas. Given people a reason to stand up for themselves, Jonas replied. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to say no. Two people, Mara corrected. We said no together. Together, Jonas agreed, and kissed the top of her head. As the sun set and the celebration finally wound down, Jonas and Mara walked back to the cabin. Their cabin now, officially and legally. The winter night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead, snow crunching beneath their boots. They didn't speak, but their hands were joined, fingers intertwined, sharing warmth. The cabin welcomed them with familiar comfort. Jonas built up the fire while Mara changed into simpler clothes, suddenly shy about this new intimacy. When she emerged from behind the privacy blanket, Jonas was standing by the window, staring out at the night. Regrets? Mara asked softly. No. He turned to face her. You? None. They stood there in the firelight, newlyweds who barely knew each other and yet knew each other better than most couples married for years. There was no pretense between them, no performance, just honesty, raw and real. I can't promise this will be easy, Jonas said. The fight with the railroad could take months, years. We might lose everything. Then we'll lose it together. Mara crossed to him, taking his weathered hands in hers. Jonas, I've spent my whole life being told I was too much, too tall, too opinionated, too ambitious. You never made me feel that way. You never asked me to be smaller. That's worth more than any land, any money, any security. Jonas pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Mara felt his heart beating steady beneath her ear. They stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, finding strength in proximity. Eventually they moved to sit by the fire, and Jonas told her stories about building the cabin, about the early years when he'd barely spoken to anyone. Mara told him about Philadelphia, about her mother's death, and her stepmother's cruelty. They shared histories, comparing scars like warriors after battle. I never thought I'd marry again, Jonas admitted. After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. And now? Now I think maybe it's just beginning. Different from before, but real. He looked at her, his gray blue eyes reflecting firelight. Mara, I can't promise you the kind of romance you probably dreamed of. I'm not a man who knows how to speak pretty words or make grand gestures. But I can promise you honesty. Partnership. A place where you're always safe, always valued, always home. That's exactly what I want, Mara said. That's all I've ever wanted. They fell asleep together by the fire, wrapped in blankets, their future uncertain, but their commitment absolute. Two wounded souls who'd found in each other not healing that would take time, but the willingness to heal, the courage to try. The fight with the railroad lasted 3 months. It was brutal, exhausting, and at times seemed hopeless. Darren used every tool at his disposal: legal challenges, financial pressure, public smear campaigns. The railroad brought in lawyers from back east, filed motion after motion, used their government connections to push the eminent domain proceedings forward. But Mara and Jonas had something Darren hadn't anticipated: a community. The ranchers and townspeople of Brimstone Ridge rallied to their defense, pooling resources for legal fees, writing letters to newspapers, contacting territorial representatives. What had started as one couple's fight became a symbol of resistance against corporate overreach. Mara worked tirelessly, her sewing business flourishing as women throughout the territory sent her commissions specifically to support the cause. She became known not just as a seamstress, but as a symbol of women's independence, proof that a woman could stand her ground against powerful men and win. Jonas found himself thrust into an unlikely role as community organizer, his quiet competence and strategic mind making him the natural leader of the resistance. He testified at hearings, coordinated legal strategies, and helped other landowners prepare their own defenses against railroad encroachment. Through it all, they built their marriage, not in grand romantic gestures, but in small moments. Jonas bringing Mara coffee while she sewed late into the night, Mara mending Jonas's shirt and finding herself smiling at the domesticity of it, the two of them sitting by the fire and discussing strategy like the partners they'd become. The turning point came in February, when a territorial judge, under pressure from newspaper coverage and public opinion, ruled that the railroad had failed to prove the necessity of the specific route through Jonas's land. Alternative routes were available. The eminent domain claim was denied. The railroad could have appealed, could have dragged the fight on for years. But public sentiment had turned against them. Their reputation was damaged, and Darren Cole, the architect of their most aggressive tactics, had become a liability. 2 weeks after the ruling, Darren left Brimstone Ridge. He didn't say goodbye, didn't make threats. He simply disappeared, called back east by a railroad board that had decided his methods were causing more problems than they solved. Mara heard the news while working in her sewing room at the cabin, now expanded with Jonas's help to accommodate her growing business. She set down her needle and walked outside to where Jonas was working on a new addition to the cabin. "He's gone," she said. Jonas straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Cole?" "Left town this morning. Mrs. Peterson just sent word." They looked at each other, and Mara saw in Jonas's expression the same mixture of relief and disbelief she felt. It was over. The fight they'd braced for, prepared for, been willing to lose everything for, it was over. "We won," Mara said, as if testing the words. "We did." Jonas set down his hammer and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. "We actually did." Mara buried her face in his chest and felt something release inside her that she hadn't known she was holding. All the fear, all the tension, all the desperate fighting, it poured out of her in shaking sobs. Jonas held her through it, his hand steady on her back, his voice murmuring comfort. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red, but her smile was real. "I'm sorry. I don't know where that came from. You've been strong for months. You're allowed to fall apart for a few minutes." Jonas brushed tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "Mara, you were magnificent. You never wavered, never backed down. I couldn't have done this without you." "We did it together. That was the whole point." "Together," Jonas agreed and kissed her properly for the first time since their wedding day. It was different now, deeper, full of promise and possibility. The weeks that followed were peaceful in a way neither of them had experienced in months. Spring arrived slowly, melting snow revealing green beneath. Jonas expanded the cabin, building Mara a proper workshop with large windows for light. Mara's business grew, her reputation spreading beyond Brimstone Ridge to neighboring territories. They fell into new rhythms, learning each other's habits and quirks. Jonas discovered that Mara hummed while she worked and hoarded fabric scraps just in case. Mara learned that Jonas was meticulous about his tools and couldn't sleep unless the fire was properly banked. They argued sometimes about politics, about money, about whether the new chicken coop should go near the barn or by the house, but they always came back together, finding compromise, choosing partnership over pride. One evening in late March, Jonas came home from town with news that he delivered with unusual excitement. The territorial legislature passed new protections for landowners, makes it much harder for companies to use eminent domain. It's because of our fight. They cited our case specifically in the legislation. Mara set down her sewing, stunned. We changed the law? We changed the law, Jonas confirmed. Mara, what we did, standing up, fighting back, it mattered. It protected not just us, but everyone who comes after. She stood and went to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. We make a good team, Mr. Hale. The best team, Mrs. Hale. They stood together in their expanded cabin, in their hard-won home, and felt the weight of months of struggle finally lift. They'd faced down powerful men and corrupt systems. They'd united a community. They'd built something real and lasting. But most importantly, they'd found each other. In May, Jonas collapsed. It happened without warning. One moment he was working in the garden, planting seeds for summer vegetables. The next he was on the ground, gasping for air, his face gray with pain. Mara ran to him, terror closing her throat. Jonas, what's wrong? Talk to me. Can't breathe. His hand clutched his chest, fingers digging into fabric. Mara screamed for help, and by some miracle Bill Hutchins was riding past and heard. Together they got Jonas into the wagon and raced for town, for the new doctor who'd arrived just weeks earlier. The diagnosis was lung fever, probably contracted from working in cold rain the previous week. The doctor, a young man fresh from medical school, looked grave as he examined Jonas. His lungs are badly compromised. The fever's high. I'll do what I can, but... He trailed off, the implications clear. But what? Mara demanded, her voice sharp with fear. But you should prepare yourself, Mrs. Hale. Lung fever is serious. Many people don't survive. Mara refused to accept that. She set up a vigil beside Jonas's bed in the cabin, refusing to leave even when exhaustion made her sway. She sponged his burning forehead with cool water, forced medicine between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow, held his hand and talked to him even when he couldn't respond. The fever raged for 8 days. Jonas drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in delirium. In his fevered state, he called out for Sarah and Emma, his lost wife and daughter. He relived the wagon accident, crying out warnings that came too late. He fought battles from the war, his body thrashing against enemies only he could see. And through it all, Mara stayed. She barely ate, hardly slept, existing in a state of suspended terror. Eleanor Thomas brought food she didn't touch. Mrs. Peterson offered to spell her at the bedside, but Mara refused. She couldn't leave. If she left, Jonas might slip away. If she left, he might think she'd abandoned him like everyone else in his life had been taken. On the 8th night, Jonas's fever broke. Mara was dozing in her chair beside the bed, her hand wrapped around his, when she felt his fingers tighten on hers. Mara, he whispered, his voice raw as sandpaper. Her eyes flew open. Jonas? Oh God, Jonas, you're awake. Water. She helped him drink, supporting his head, her hand shaking so badly she nearly spilled the cup. Jonas drank deeply, then fell back against the pillows, exhausted by even that small effort. You stayed, he said, his gray-blue eyes finding hers. Of course I stayed. Did you think I'd leave? I heard you when I was, wherever I was, lost. I heard your voice. It pulled me back. His hand tightened on hers. Mara, I was ready to let go, to stop fighting, but your voice kept calling me home. Tears streamed down Mara's face. You're not allowed to leave me, Jonas Hale. We have too much left to do, too much life left to live. Yes, he whispered. Yes, we do. The recovery was slow. It took weeks before Jonas could stand without assistance, months before he could work for more than a few hours without exhaustion overwhelming him. But gradually, steadily, he healed. And in healing, something changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained, the boundaries drawn around hearts too wounded to risk fully opening, those walls came down. They'd married for practical reasons, had built partnership and respect and friendship. But somewhere during those 8 days when Mara refused to let Jonas die, somewhere in the desperate grip of her hands on his, their relationship transformed into something deeper. Love. Not the dramatic sweep-you-off-your-feet romance of storybooks, but something better. Something rooted in choice and built through trial. Something that had earned the right to be called love through every fight they'd faced together, every obstacle they'd overcome. One evening in July, Jonas and Mara sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Jonas had his arm around Mara's shoulders, and she leaned into him, comfortable in the silence they'd learned to share. "Do you remember what you said the first night I stayed here?" Mara asked. "I said a lot of things. When I asked where I should sleep, you said, 'Right here.' You pointed to the blankets by the fire." Mara turned to look at him. "I thought it meant just that night, just shelter from the storm. But it meant more than that, didn't it?" Jonas considered, his thumb rubbing slow circles on her shoulder. "I didn't know it then. But yes, I think part of me recognized that you belonged here. That right here wasn't just about one night. It was about all the nights to come." "Right here," Mara repeated softly, "beside you, in this home we built, in this life we chose." "Right here," Jonas echoed. "Always." They sat together as the sun set and the stars emerged, two people who'd been broken by life and had found in each other the strength to become whole. They'd faced down powerful enemies and won. They'd built a business, built a home, built a community. They'd changed laws and changed lives. But most importantly, they'd changed each other. Jonas had learned that caring for someone didn't mean losing them, that love could be chosen and sustained through action rather than just feeling. Mara had learned that she didn't have to shrink herself to fit someone else's vision, that her strength and height and stubborn independence were assets, not flaws. A year after their wedding, Mara opened her shop in town, Ellington and Company, Fine Stitching, in a building Jonas helped her purchase with the compensation the railroad eventually paid for a different route through less contested land. The shop thrived, drawing customers from throughout the territory. Women came for Mara's skill with needle and thread, but they stayed for her friendship, her advice, her unwavering belief that women deserve to stand tall and claim space in the world. Jonas expanded their land, helping new families settle in the area, offering advice and assistance to those trying to build lives in the harsh territory. He became known as a man who'd faced down corruption and won, whose quiet integrity made him a natural leader, even though he never sought the role. Together, they became the refuge they'd once needed. When families arrived in Brimstone Ridge with nowhere to stay, Mara and Jonas opened their doors. When young women fled controlling situations, they found sanctuary and work at Mara's shop. When landowners faced pressure from outside forces, they found an ally in Jonas's strategic mind and hard-won legal knowledge. The cabin expanded over the years, growing from 1 room to 3, then to a proper house with a workshop attached. The land around it flourished under Jonas's care. And through it all, through every season and every challenge, Mara and Jonas stood together. They never forgot where they'd started. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, Jonas would spread blankets by the fire like he had that first night, and they would lie there together, remembering what it felt like to be desperate and alone, remembering the moment when a quiet stranger had offered shelter without judgment, remembering the choice they'd made to stand together against everything that tried to tear them apart. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked one such night, her head pillowed on Jonas's chest. "Letting me stay that first night, everything that came after?" Jonas's hand stroked through her hair, gentle and constant. "Not for a single moment. You walked into my life during a storm, and you brought with you something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope, purpose, a reason to keep fighting." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You gave me back my life, Mara, and I'll spend the rest of it being grateful." "We gave each other life," Mara corrected. "That's how this works. That's what we do." "Right here," Jonas whispered. "Right here," Mara agreed. "Always." Outside, the winter wind howled and snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white. But inside their home, the home they'd built together, defended together, filled with love earned through trial, Mara and Jonas Hale lay warm and safe. Two wounded souls, healed. Two wanderers, finally home. A complete, closed love story, rooted, earned, and forever. Right here, always.